morning. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Oh,
I'll probably just stand here. Thank you.
okay.
Yep. Awesome. So good morning, and I will talk about kind of a summary. And we've already heard some excellent presentations, and we'll hear some excellent information after this. So kind of view my presentation as a little bit of a smattering of each one of these things from a broader standpoint and some more on the environmental component. So to get started, if we talk about sustainable food systems require livestock, we should probably also first start of saying, well, what is a sustainable food system, or even a food system, right? Sometimes this is a little bit different idea than what we may be encountering when we're thinking about this from an animal science perspective. So this graphic here, I know for those in the back, is probably small, but a nice overview from this publication from a couple of years ago of, as we look at this, right, within this circle of this food system, there's several different things happening. So at the top is more of the farming and the actual production of those foods, right, safe foods hopefully, that people are consuming. And then we have those economic factors and the economic system that is interfacing with it. So if we think about why that's important, right, everything from the access to capital, how people are actually funding their operations, and of course how the people that are eaters, which is all of us, are able to afford that food is also incredibly important from this food system perspective. And then the other domains on here are the environmental. So of course we depend on our biological systems, our natural ecosystems, and the earth system, right, in terms of our actual food production and those components. And the social side of things, thinking about demand levers, right? Why and what do people demand, right? How does that relate back to the prices that folks are receiving and the affordability? And as Peter will talk about, thinking about how this interfaces, of course, with human health and this broader concept of health, right, from the whole system. So again, I put this up here just to, when we think about food systems and sustainability, there's no way that we can talk about all of this even within this symposium of all the different intersections and complexities that are at play when we talk about livestock's role in these food systems. If we look at another definition here at a high level from the UN FAO, we can define a sustainable food system as one that delivers food and nutritional security for all in such a way that the social and environmental bases to generate that food security are not compromised, right? So kind of building in that core definition of sustainable development from the UN. So thinking about today, but also in the future, and those three different pillars or components of sustainability. So I think most people would agree on this, but once we get into the details, that's where it gets sticky, right? How do we define these things? What are the value judgments that are at play, right? And as we heard about, thinking about the cultural aspects of food and the choices people make, or even religious influences, etc. It's not quite as simple and straightforward as a one-size-fits-all solution. So with that, where do livestock fit? So we'll kind of think about this from a broader perspective. And as I go through this, I think a good place to start is, why do we have a lot of these concerns when it comes to sustainability? And that, of course, is that we're not necessarily in a stagnant situation. We have had a growing world population, and that has put pressures, right, on our natural ecosystems and from a food production perspective. So if we were to just look at that context, what we're looking at here on this graphic is, on the left-hand side y-axis, our global population, which is in green. And then on the right-hand side, the actual annual percent change in growth rate over time. So a few things, right? We have had a lot more people coming home to dinner, right, in the last several decades. Global population is now above 8 billion people. But that rate of growth is slowing. Right? And so this is kind of a unique time in history, I would say, over the next few decades, where we're still going to have that growing world population, more pressure, more of that growth taking place in the global south. But there is a reality that we will probably also peak in our global population before the end of this century, and we're having already in many developed countries significant demographic shifts that also create health challenges and other potential issues, right, from a social standpoint. As we look at this global population growth rate, I also think it's important, as we look at this, you may say, well, what happened in the late 50s, early 60s? I think most of this is actually driven by China's Great Leap Forward, right? So social programs at a large level can have sometimes negative impacts there where we had a mass famine in China and significant drops in growth rate. Right? But over time, we are significantly decreasing the rate of growth. So that's important, still growing. And as we just heard, when we think about staple crops and we think about global agriculture, there is a tremendous success in terms of just getting more energy to people. Nutritional security is not energy, but if we look at this graphic here of energy supply per person per year, that has actually grown over time while we have increased global population. So it's important to kind of recognize that as well of we have been pretty good in our food system at producing more energy. Whether we're distributing it equally to people and whether it's also bringing along the nutrients that we need is another question. But at least from a standpoint of increasing energy supply, that's definitely increased over time. The other thing on this graphic are these two different colors, right? So animal source foods from a standpoint of energy, relatively minor, right? But we're bringing along those other micronutrients that we talked about that are important. But as I'll emphasize a couple of times, right, ultimately we do eat a plant-based diet if you consider it from an energy source standpoint as a global average and in every country around the world. So from a macronutrient standpoint, right, of course, animal source foods are much more than just simply crude protein, right, or fat. But if we think about those contributions, they are important, right? But again, not above 50% from those standpoints, but it's those other micronutrients that are being brought along that we just heard in excellent detail that are really important. We can also look at this, though, and say from a global average perspective, there's probably a lot of room for improvement, right, in terms of improving the supply or the availability, especially to certain vulnerable populations. And so building on some of this work and some of this work from that, summarizing some work that the Livestock Lab did, right? This is a stat that, for me, I was shocked when I first heard a presentation from BOLA and to see the statistic that 1 in 4 children in the world under 5 are stunted, right? And that nutrition is a significant portion of that challenge and improving that. So there's a lot of wasted human potential from that standpoint of improving the quality of life for people around the world, and then what the benefits would be for all of society globally if we can do that. The other thing that we're looking at here is some information from Ty Beal and others of a publication that came out a few years ago. And so these little scatter plots on the slide are representing on the x-axis the percent of kilocalories in a given nation coming from animal source foods, ASF, and then the rate of micronutrient deficiencies of each one of those nutrients listed. And so really the relationship is summarized over here on the right-hand side, right? That from that analysis, those countries that had an average of 35% of their energy coming from animal source foods saw far fewer of those micronutrient deficiencies. So keeping that in mind of that 35% threshold, if we were to look simply at UNFAO data of supply of animal source foods as a percent of kilocalories around the world, how many nations are actually hitting that 35% threshold, right? It's not that many. So as we look at this graphic here from that data summarized from 2022, the countries with the highest rate are those that, unsurprisingly, right, traditionally their food systems rely a lot on animal source foods. So places like Iceland or, of course, Mongolia, where we have a lot of grazing ruminants, a much higher percentage of their kilocalories are coming from animal source foods. Much of the global south is not in that situation, right? And even in the United States, we're actually below that 35% threshold, right? We have an abundance of calories, but things like Twinkies are also plant-based, right? So we have a lot of energy and maybe not as nutrient-dense as we need in the United States as well. And all I'll say in this, because we just heard an excellent presentation and we will hear from Peter, who will summarize this as well, is this is a controversial field, right? And maybe more controversial sometimes than the scientific evidence merits, but because there's so many things tied up in this conversation about sustainability. So this here on the left is just a screenshot from this report that has been mentioned, right? The Eat Lancet report that came out in 2019. There's going to be another version released this fall. It has been quite influential from a standpoint of policy. And sometimes that's where we have to focus these conversations, is how these publications can have influence at that policy level and even global effects because of that. I've just pulled out this one screenshot, and again, knowing that it's small here, I'll just read a bit of this. from this Eat Lancet report, solutions to the problems highlighted by the Commission, meaning the Eat Lancet Commission, will require hard work, political will, and many resources. People may warn of unintended consequences or argue the case for action is premature and should be left to existing dynamics. However, we disagree. Data are sufficient and strong enough to warrant action. Delay will increase the likelihood of serious, even disastrous consequences. Right? The approaches taken in the Great Food Transformation should be guided by scientific targets that define the safe operating space for food systems. So this was a key component of this commission where, and still I would say, there's a pre-existing belief that plant-based is going to be better for you and better for the planet. And then evidence is collected to support that assertion, right? And so we need to pay attention to what does the evidence actually say and always question some of those underlying assumptions that are underpinning some of this. I think the Great Food Transformation maybe has gotten some pushback from a standpoint of the phrasing, and again, maybe a little too close to the Great Leap Forward that I mentioned earlier, but there's a lot of pressure to make those kind of changes. I would say this is a good counterpoint of a publication that came out in Animal, and just highlighting here this other excerpt, right? Policymakers and influencers are increasingly calling for far-reaching substitution of animal source foods by plant alternatives. These offer opportunities for investors, but should not be seen as fully equivalent products, right, as we heard, when viewed beyond nutritional reductionism. So I put these two things up here to say these are both peer-reviewed publications. We're in a unique situation, right, where we can find anything to support any of our prior beliefs currently when it comes to the sustainability of food systems in the literature. And that's one of our challenges in this space, is that we all do have biases, but it's important to realize where does the evidence allow us to make assertions. And sometimes we have this situation of folks that really want to take action, and maybe the evidence is not necessarily there, or the unintended consequences are not necessarily clear. So one of those key things that comes up with sustainability is often in this context, in this framing of we have a growing world population, we have limited resources, we have to think about the competition between livestock and people from a standpoint of feed resources and, of course, land resources as well. This is not a new idea, right? We can go back and actually gave a presentation a few years ago. You can find in the first edition of Journal of Animal Science, actually, this issue is mentioned, right, back in 1909. So it's something that comes up again and again. Sustainability is not necessarily new. I would say the current environment really has been shaped by a lot of the thinking in the environmental space in the mid-20th century forward, right? And I pulled this book out as one example. We could think about the population bomb from Paul Ehrlich as another example of this concern about growing world population. How are we going to nourish ourselves, and how are we going to do it sustainably? So this book, Diet for a Small Planet, was definitely influential. In this excerpt here on the side, the author just mentions she realized, how much grain these animals are consuming. She highlights, of all the animals we eat, cattle are probably the poorest converters of grain to meat. It takes 16 pounds of grain and soybeans to produce 1 pound of beef in the U.S. today. So written in the 1970s. So this kind of popular press material still continues today when we think about some of that information that Keith shared earlier about the carbon opportunity cost of livestock, for example. A lot of that is tied up in this idea of the land use and the potential better uses of land for not using it for livestock. So historically, this is interesting because in response to this, some animal scientists, I think this is the first reference I've seen of this kind of calculation, put forward this idea of, okay, well, we need to think about feed use efficiency in different ways, particularly under this social kind of construct, or this tension that we have of we need to nourish ourselves and to think about nutrient-dense foods. And so human edible feed conversion is referenced in this publication that was summarized in 1980 from Bywater and Baldwin, where I pulled up this quote here, right? A fundamental issue in terms of which efficiency is expressed. So the ultimate concern is total human food production. It seems only rational to calculate animal efficiency in terms of inputs of human edible energy and protein, not in terms of total feed inputs, right? Since these livestock are consuming many things that we cannot consume. So just as an example here, this is information from that summary back in 1980. Up on the left-hand side here, these numbers that are expressed are saying, well, what is the inputs going into these systems in terms of mcals of energy and kilograms of protein, and the percent return, meaning how much is actually returned from those animal products relative to those inputs. And then the authors did the calculation of taking into account what is actually human edible. And if we especially focus in on the protein, right, of the returns on the left-hand side versus what just was revealed over here on the right-hand side, particularly our ruminant animals, right, we can see the tremendous improvement in that return percentage, right? And above 100% for these systems that were evaluated at that time in this case study for milk and beef, meaning these animals are returning more human edible protein than actually consuming. And of course that's possible because of the fact that they are ruminants and able to use poor quality or non-protein nitrogen sources. And so I've used this graphic as one many times of just to highlight this as a case study example of this idea of human edible returns, and then adding to it this idea of protein quality, right? But I would also say this is a good summary of how within the sustainability space, one can use different metrics and come to different answers, and that's where we have that value judgments component of sustainability as well. So as we're looking at this, right, this first column is just saying pounds or kilograms of feed per kilogram of live weight, and this is just saying dry matter, right, for the full system. So for the top here, we have the U.S. grain finished beef life cycle average, and down at the bottom, and working our way up, we have a couple examples from the UK, from this Wilkinson paper in 2011, and then an example here of broiler chickens. So there are big disparities, and that's not surprising, right? From a standpoint of ruminants require more dry matter to produce product. It's something that we all know and understand. When we convert or think about how much of that feed stuff is actually human edible in the middle column, there's not many differences in those systems, right? Similar inputs from a human edible standpoint, particularly, right, corn, grain, and soybean inputs into those systems. And then if we go to the third column, this is taking into account the digestible indispensable amino acid score of the actual product itself, so the beef, the pork, the chicken, or the milk, and then the same for the feedstuff going into the animal. And if we consider also the digestible indispensable amino acid score of the feed inputs going into the animal. And so here we can see our monogastrics, because we have to use more high quality protein sources to feed and nourish those animals, their scores look lower, right, than our ruminants that can eat poorer quality feedstuffs and make high quality outputs. So all that's to say of, again, as we move from one side to the other, the question of which is best, right, changes, and we may have our own biases about which one of those is, or maybe none of these are the best expression, right, of this feed food competition. But I think this highlights the complexity of this from a standpoint of where ruminants fit and where livestock in general fit, right? Because there's a lot of other nutritional upgrading that's happening within chicken and pork, right? Besides just protein and of course also taste, right? Most people would much rather consume bacon than corn soy mix. And then if we also think about this more broadly, we have to think about bigger picture issues when it comes to ecosystem goods and services, right? So there's a huge category of things that are coming from livestock production or enhanced, and in some cases degraded by livestock production, right, in this systems, goods, and services space. So even if we were to look at this kind of bucolic setting with these animals, right, everything from pollinator habitat, other wildlife habitat, right, water infiltration and cleaning, right, from a standpoint of having permanent grasslands and forages, right, holding soil in place, reducing erosion risk, the aesthetic value that livestock provide, the cultural value that livestock provide in many of our cultures. All of those things sometimes have a hard time putting numeric values on, but are incredibly important in terms of the bigger picture and the contributions that livestock provide to a sustainable food system. Often in this space we're thinking more about, instead of ecosystem services, disservices, and we could say one of those things would be, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. So if we think about the global picture of greenhouse gas emissions from a life cycle perspective, this information is from the UNFAO, from their latest assessment relative to the year 2015 of where those emissions are actually coming from. So from a life cycle perspective, approximately 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. And as we look at the Sankey diagram, right, this is just highlighting that most of those emissions are actually coming from cattle and coming from enteric fermentation specifically, so the methane that is naturally produced by these ruminant animals. So this is where our opportunity lies, and we heard a lot about this earlier, right, from a standpoint of developing countries and places where we can really focus, in addition to developed countries, right, and where we can have potentially more solutions in feed, if you will, from that standpoint. So just to highlight this in terms of this complexity, there's a lot of variation, right? So while that may be the global average, where those emissions are coming from and where the production comes from is very variable, right? So as we look at these different graphics here, beef production is in the upper left-hand corner, and we can see the US and Brazil are really key beef producers, of course. But when we think about CO2 emissions in the bottom middle here, right, we notice that Brazil actually produces more CO2 emissions than the United States, even though we produce more beef. And that comes down to those number of animals that are actually required to produce that amount of product, right? Some of that is inherent to different tropical systems, right, different breeds that we have, but there's a huge opportunity there, as we heard earlier, in thinking about idle animals or animals that are not producing, right, non-productive animals, but are still consuming feed resources, still using human resources and producing emissions potentially, but not necessarily contributing to human food. That's a big opportunity for us. And then in the upper right-hand corner is emissions intensity, right? So we see some of those countries that, if you recall those earlier graphics, right, had low animal source food availability, also have high emission intensity, right? And back to that idea of the productivity component of these livestock systems and the opportunity to potentially improve both human nutrition outcomes and lower environmental impacts by improving productivity. The other key thing is none of these things are static over time, and so there's been tremendous improvements in developing and developed countries alike from a standpoint of reducing emissions intensity specifically. So this is CO2 equivalent emissions per unit of beef carcass weight. So we have from 1961 to 2022 in Australia, Brazil, the EU, Ireland, and the USA. So there's a few things happening here, right? If we even look at the EU, quite low emissions intensities for much of the time point, and a lot of that is a great example of dual purpose, right? From the standpoint of a higher percentage of their animals for beef are coming from the dairy herd in the EU as compared to, say, the United States. The US, we've had pretty steady declines. Brazil has also made tremendous improvements, right, in terms of reducing emissions intensities over time. So that is important, and we need to continue that, but it's also important when we have these conversations. This is where things get complex. We have, say, different countries or different, whether it's in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement, or different companies that have made climate commitments that are about absolute emissions or total emissions. And so while these reductions are very impressive, they don't always translate into reductions in total emissions, right? So if our growth of our cattle herd or our growth of total production exceeds our improvements in efficiencies, we're still going to have growth in total emissions, right? So a good example here would be, as we look at this, now we have emissions on the left-hand side y-axis, and total emissions, for example, in Brazil have dramatically increased because the total number of cattle from 1961 to today has increased over time. Right? Certain countries, such as the US, right, if we think about the EU, a lot of our developed countries have actually declined the total number of ruminants they have, so total emissions have gone down in the long run. So with all that said, right, there's many ways we can think about sustainability and sustainability of food systems. One way to think about this is maybe we need to think about it as a balance sheet, right, for livestock. What are the things that are assets? What are the things that are liabilities? And how can we turn those liabilities potentially into assets or minimize them to improve the actual equity, if you will, or the contributions of livestock to a sustainable food system? So I've listed some of these things on here under the liabilities. I've listed this just to trigger Peter of health risks of overconsumption of livestock or animal source foods. And this is part of that controversy of what is the correct amount of livestock sourced foods to actually consume. But we have a lot of things that we would need to consider in such an analysis, right? And things that are going to change based on the culture that we're talking about, right? In terms of where livestock fit within that culture, within that country. Of course, livestock are producing nutrient-dense foods. They have a lot of non-food contributions, even things such as pharma products, right? If I think about even my father-in-law has like a cow heart valve, right? That's actually keeping him alive. So how do we put a value on that, right? From a standpoint of the significance of livestock in our food system. So I put this out here. I don't think we have a comprehensive analysis like this, and maybe we need one, right, from that standpoint of trying to put it together of the pluses and minuses and how we can improve. So if we were to think about this from a standpoint of that right-hand side of the slide and the liabilities, how could we improve? And if we think about some of those ecosystem disservices, the UNFAO had a really nice report that came out in December of 2023 called The Pathways Towards Lower Emissions. And this waterfall chart is from that report. So if you're not familiar with it, I would definitely say to check it out in terms of a very high-level summary of what are some of those opportunities to reduce emissions in the global livestock sector. So as we look at this graphic, the way to look at this is starting on that far left-hand side would be saying where are those emissions today, the height of that bar, and the base year of comparison. And the different colors are referring to different greenhouse gases, with methane in red, nitrous oxide in blue, and carbon dioxide in this kind of black or gray color. The second bar over from the left is where we would be headed in the future if we make no improvements. So our business as usual, where we would be headed. And that height of that third bar over is what the sum of that would be. With no improvements, business as usual, headed to where we are in 2050. Each one of these segments from that third bar over to the right are opportunities potentially to reduce emissions. And so for those folks that can't necessarily see those, the biggest opportunities that are listed are productivity increases, so improving the productivity of livestock production around the world, breeding, right? So for genetic improvement, that's probably going to impact productivity, impact feed efficiency, for example, impact potentially methane emissions. And then our other key category here is actually improved animal health, right? So again, a way to think about improving productivity from the standpoint of reducing morbidity, reducing mortality, reducing losses that are associated with animal health. So that's important. And the other thing to point out is dietary changes is the little bar right next to the projected 2050 emissions. So there is an assumption that potentially dietary changes could reduce emissions in terms of our dietary changes, not livestock, but say humans consuming less animal source foods. But this was a bit controversial when this came out for some of the folks that have perspectives that dietary changes would be a bigger impact, that they did not appreciate the UNFAO saying that it's not the largest potential impact, right? And so some of that is the challenges, again, of those different value judgments and the approach that these folks took in terms of modeling this, right, of the reality of macro trends are people are going to consume more animal source foods, particularly as countries develop, right? And so to say that we're going to reverse that trend is very difficult. When it comes to productivity, just as an example here of why this matters, it matters in terms of reducing emissions, but also avoiding growth in emissions. And so this would be a U.S. example here of going from 1975, which is when we had the largest cattle herd in the United States, forward to today. So as you look at this graphic, the green is where we are. That's what's happened in the U.S. in terms of the number of cattle in the U.S. over time. And in the orange is what would have happened if we had to produce the same amount of beef, but we had not improved our efficiency at all. We still produce the same amount of beef per live animal in the U.S. over time. So in 2022, we have 63 million fewer cattle than we would if we had no improvements in productivity. So that highlights, again, while methane inhibitors and other things to try to reduce emissions directly from animals can be a good potential opportunity, the basics of thinking about animal science, animal husbandry, that land grant system that was highlighted earlier, make a huge impact in terms of why those two numbers or two lines have diverged. Right? The genetics, the management, the nutrition of these animals makes a huge difference. When it comes to health, there's a few more papers out there now of trying to quantify some of the environmental benefits of health, and this is one example from 2015 of looking at the UK beef and dairy systems, of saying what would be the increase in greenhouse gas emissions per liter of milk or per unit of beef from a standpoint of comparing healthy animals and healthy systems versus those that have higher rates of things like Johne's disease, BVD, right? Higher rates of infertility, for example, or calf pneumonia. So in most of those cases, right, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the carbon footprint of production in each one of those systems when we have higher rates of health issues. There are other pieces of literature that would support that, and so that's one of those things that we assume, but there's quantitative evidence to highlight that as well. Of healthier animals lead to fewer resources being used, right, and hopefully more high-quality nutrition for every animal in our livestock system. And that would drive home that One Health concept, right, that is very complementary to this idea of a sustainable food system. And health, of course, is more than just the lack of disease, right, and same thing with human health, right? It's more about that quality of life and that more holistic picture. But One Health is that concept of putting together human health, animal health, and environmental health. And in the last several years, I would say with global pandemics or, for example, the bird flu issues that we're dealing with in the United States, this has become more prescient in terms of One Health is a real concept that's very important for us to consider, right? So some of the statistics on here are really important, right? One is that 20% of global animal production losses can potentially be attributed to animal disease. So back to that idea or that question about food waste, food loss, right? That's a huge opportunity for us to improve. And one of those things that maybe people don't think about of like the immune system in animals and those aspects having a direct impact potentially on the quality of life of people and on food availability and food security, nutritional security for folks in the future. So it is a very complex system where all these things are connected. And finally, when we think about technical solutions, particularly in more developed countries, so great technologies such as 3-nitroxypropanol or Bovaer. We saw a bit of controversy right at the end of last year and early this year, particularly in the UK and Europe, around as one of the milk companies announced that they were piloting some of this technology on farms, right? And some people on social media took offense to that in terms of what are you feeding animals? Is this unnatural? What is it doing to the quality of meat and milk? Is it safe, right? Is it safe for people to handle? So there's a lot of these questions out there around technologies that we use, and maybe all those safety questions, in particular in this case, are answered, but that's back to that idea of communication, right? And making sure that folks are aware where they need to be of answering questions around the safety of food and how they view it. And this tension always of people want natural whole foods sometimes, but we also need to make progress and innovation, right? That tension is real. I don't really have an answer of how we get around that, but just this would be a cautionary tale of when this kind of blew up on social media of an example of why anticipating those things is really important. Right? So, bottom line, to be assertive in that, right? Sustainable food systems require livestock. If we thought about that balance sheet concept, I would say for sure we have very much net positive equity, right, in our balance sheet in terms of livestock's contribution to sustainable food systems. But it's really complicated in terms of how we put a value on that, right? And because of the complexity of the system, the diversity of systems, and the judgments that we're all bringing to it in terms of what kind of value we would put on some of those assets and liabilities. So while they are, I would say, a net benefit today to our sustainable food systems, we also need to think about what are those opportunities. And there are a lot of opportunities to continue to improve, right? Of course, those areas that I mentioned, if we think about genetics, management, nutrition, right? Think about the health of animals. But when we think about this, I think the key is doing research in this area or extension. Thinking about integrated system approaches is really key. Thinking about, in many cases, both in developed and developing countries, involving primary producers, involving the people that are actually doing the work of producing livestock is absolutely key from the standpoint of making progress. So, with that said, thank you very much for your attention. I think we have some time for questions before our break.